What is going on, YouTube? So I wanted to come back today. It's been a while since I had done, well, I guess a non-box break video that I did some of those yesterday. We're kind of throwing it back a little bit. Like I said, I had some time this week to just kind of give my take on a few topics, just that I've kind of been covering recently for sports. I've talked about this before that on the side I kind of cover the Longhorns, the Chicago Bulls. So I've been firmly entrenched in the situation this year concerning the Longhorns and Tom Herman, the incredibly hot and continually getting hotter seat that he sits on this season. Um, and it's just been kind of a frustrating team to watch and to cover and to try to get a grip on. I mean, really since the 2018 season, and even 2018 started off weird as a whole throughout the Tom Herman tenure. Um, I don't know. It's just been really, really hard to get a grasp on all of what's going on, how it's trending. And I just think that no matter what, you're going to continue to see these problems. Thank you. Thank you, Blaine. But you're going to continue to see these problems coming from Herman and from the Longhorns. When his backup is up against the wall, much like Shaka Smart for their basketball program, they tend to do really well. And I have no doubt that they're actually going to finish the season out pretty strong. But there's going to be some more disappointment along the way. No matter what, you're going to have problems with Tom Herman. And even the recruiting results for the 2021 class, if y'all followed that, if you're a Longhorns fan or just a Big 12 fan, it's been kind of frustrating. They just lost their second highest rated commit in the 2021 class. Billy Bowman Jr. looks like he's headed to join Lincoln Riley and the Sooners. And then beyond that, their next highest rated prospect beyond Jatavian Sanders, I believe, is Ishmael Ibrahim, and he's barely rated inside the 247 Sports Composite Top 150. So even the recruiting success for 2021 is not great. 2022 looks really promising with Quinn Ewers, probably going to be their top or their highest rated quarterback commit since Vince Young. So that's obviously big, but you kind of got to weigh the risk reward here between, well, do we want to wait out, kind of play the patience game with Herman, give him a fifth year, or do you just want to let this go? This is the year, though. This is really the year for the Longhorns, and I know that there's just a ton going on, but this is one of the few programs in the country where I think it still could have all come together this year, and that Herman still faced some criticism if it didn't end well. A lot of this is a spillover from the frustrations from last season where the Longhorns were a top 10 rated team. I thought that was a little bit overhyped from their 2018 campaign. They were a really inexperienced team last season, but this year there's not much of an excuse. Herman's never had a more talented or experienced roster at Texas. 2018 came close, but wasn't really up to par with this one. The injury bug, while it's gotten steadily worse this year and seems to bite Tom Herman worse than it did Mac Brown or Charlie Strong, I'm going to touch on that here in a moment, but I don't know what's up with that. I mean, this year I get it, but the injury bug bit them really, really bad last year. 2 years ago, I don't remember it was all that bad. I mean, a few things here for Ellinger, and I mean, he's always had injury troubles. It seems just he's hit so frequently, but he plays through it. He had a thigh contusion that he was dealing with earlier this season, but I kind of want to get into the weeds and get into the problems that I feel like face the Longhorns as a whole, and ones that might not be fixed under Herman, just given the fact that he was kind of given a blank slate as far as his coaching staff was concerned last offseason. Their athletic director, Chris Del Conte, really opened up the checkbook and was like, okay, here you go. Go hire whoever you can. He went out and hired Mike Yursich as the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, Chris Ash, and special teams coach Jay Boulware. Those were the three key hires. Some promotions internally with the staff. Andre Coleman got a promotion to wide receivers coach. I'm missing one. I believe their linebackers coach was an internal promotion from an analyst or a quality control coach as well, but I have to go back and check that. The coordinator hires. Mike Yursich. So I'm an Oklahoma State grad, Oklahoma State fan at heart. I cover the Longhorns, and I hope they do well. I just try to be unbiased about everything as far as Texas goes, even when they're playing Oklahoma State. But point being, I've watched Yursich's offenses for a while now, and the problem for Yursich that I always noticed, and that Oklahoma State fans and people in the Oklahoma State media always had with him, was kind of lack of rhythm, weird play calls at weird times, lots of draws and inside count, or a lot of draws, counters, things like that on third down and long. if you watched Red River, there was a wheel route, or at least a go route, that was thrown to Bijan Robinson. And Ellinger completely overshot it, but it was a third and short, and something where it felt like any other play call would have worked. Yursic's numbers look really good this season, just in terms of points, but you have to consider, like, this is through 4 overtimes against OU and UTEP. TCU held them to, and again, this is including that safety there at the end, 31 points. Really, the offense for Texas only got like in the mid to high 20s. And then against Texas Tech, it was a frantic comeback at the end. You exclude like 29 points from Texas scoring in the final like 2 minutes of the Texas Tech and OU games, and then some, 24 points between the 2 overtimes. You actually have an offense that's closer to averaging in the high 30s. And so those numbers that Yursic's offense is performing to is a little bit inflated. And vice versa, I think Chris Ash's defense, while they are giving up at this point, the last couple of weeks, some pretty bad numbers just in terms of yardage and points, I actually think there's signs where it's improving. But when Texas was under Todd Orlando, they didn't really have that problem of just notoriously bad defense always. Todd Orlando definitely had his pluses as a defensive coordinator, hence why he got the job at USC. We'll see how that goes. It will be really interesting to see. But I think Ash is the better of the two coordinator hires, giving up 36.2 points per game. Let's see how many yards this year, giving up exactly 400. So not great, but I think there's room to improve there. They're not coming up big when they need to, which I think is a problem, just stemming back to the entirety of the coaching staff and just kind of the players, the culture as a whole, that they're just getting weird roller coaster rides of momentum during games. And I don't know how much of an upgrade the Chris Ash hire is from Todd Orlando. I actually think the offense this year under Yurcich and Herman looks a little bit worse than it did in the last 2 years under Tim Beck and Tom Herman. And I know some Texas fans are going to have conflicting views with that, but I don't know. I don't know if it's just a product of Sam Ehlinger losing Devin Duvernay and Colin Johnson. The running game should be better, but it really hasn't been. The offensive line has been suspect at times. So I don't know how much blame you can really place back on Yurcich. But if you compare Tim Beck's numbers with NC State this year to where Texas was at last year compared to this year, Tim Beck's actually done a pretty good job at NC State. I believe they're averaging about like 5 or 10 more points per game, and they're about 80 yards per game improved, at least the last time that I checked. I know they played Virginia since, so that might have changed drastically. But Tim Beck's had a pretty positive impact at NC State. NC State's one of the kind of more underrated surprise teams in the ACC right now, and a lot of that goes back to Dave Dorn and then just having a more experienced team this year than they did last. But I think that's a good example of where Yurcich might not have been that good of a coordinator hire. And again, I had my frustrations with him at Oklahoma State, as did a lot of Oklahoma State fans. And just going back through Ohio State, there's not a whole lot that you can draw off that, I don't think, because I think Ryan Day kind of had the reins at Ohio State for the offense, and Mike Yurcich was just the passing game coordinator. He wasn't the full-on play caller. And then special teams. Special teams has been the biggest disaster, I think, if you're considering these three sides of the ball for Texas. Jay Boulware's had some decent stops before at Auburn, OU, namely in the last like 10, 12 years. I don't know how much that really goes back to him, but there's a problem on special teams. Buchevsky's had multiple block punts. Dicker's been okay, pretty good, but the onside kicks that were almost recovered against OU, and then the one that was recovered against Texas Tech were really nice. But they did have kind of a bad snap, bad hold block kick in overtime that almost resulted in them losing the game just off that one play, again, in the loss to OU. And Deshaun Jameson has a muffed punt. It's just been kind of a disaster on special teams this year. Lots of special teams mishaps. I think that's special teams is usually a problem that always traces back to coaching, because Buchevsky's had his ups and downs, but he hasn't been all that bad throughout his career. And then you see a player that transferred out of Texas, like Chris Nagart, who is now the kicker at SMU and who is having one of the better seasons of any kicker. And he's been pretty good as a punter too in the country. And he backed up Cameron Dicker and then didn't take over the punting duties last year, I believe, until Ryan Buchevsky got hurt. So special teams is a huge problem. I think that's one that traces back to Herman and just not getting the right hires or the right personnel on the staff to command special teams. Defense, still a work in progress. I think there's still growing pains, but with Texas having Baylor and Oklahoma State coming up, I think that they can be tested pretty heavily. We'll see how Baylor shows up after all the COVID-19 cases they're dealing with. And then Oklahoma State, they've actually been a defensive-heavy team this year outside of Kansas, but they still have a ton of weapons between Spencer Sanders, Chuba Hubbard, Tylan Wallace. That's a lot to deal with. Especially when they meet teams like, let me think who they got throughout the rest of the slate. I mean, Kansas State's looked pretty good on offense at different times. Iowa State's going to be a test on the ground. There's teams that are going to push Texas. And the defense, again, has been up and down, but largely it hasn't been all that improved. So I want to get to the last point here that I have that I think is a major mark against Herman this year, just in terms of play on the field and things like that. And that's really the penalties. The penalties and the discipline just have not been there. Texas is averaging almost 90 penalty yards against per game, whereas their opponents, I think, are somewhere in the ballpark of like 60 to like maybe 60 or 65. They also have almost 10 penalties per game. Now, OU and Texas Tech, sure, those games did go into overtime, but I believe this is the most penalized Texas team, even under Tom Herman. And Texas, while they had their ups and downs under Mac Brown's teams, usually were not all that penalized. Yes, this is the most penalized Texas team by a good margin. Also, I would be interested to see what their penalty yardage what their penalty yardage looks like compared to the rest of the country or compared to the rest of the FBS teams that have played this year, because it's pretty bad. Again, about 10 penalties per game and 90 yards against, close to it. Huge problem. And again, that traces back to coaching. That one is what kind of pushes it over the brink or, over the edge for me. Tom, let me kind of get back to the bigger picture here and why I feel like there's more pros than cons in getting rid of Tom Herman in the near future. The buyout numbers were just released for what each of the FBS head coaches would cost to get bought out as of this year and before December 1st of 2020. Tom Herman's was around $15 million, which is clearly a large number, but it's like the 40th biggest buyout in the FBS. Considering he's already been here for 4 years and what it would have been maybe 2 years ago, and I believe Charlie Strong's buyout was somewhere in that ballpark too. I could be wrong on that, but something certainly to check on. I don't think the buyout would be all that much of a snag. I think the main thing is just a weird pandemic year, and then they're also at a weird point in the regular season. It's hard to part ways with a coach 4 weeks in when you have so much uncertainty for the rest of the coaching staff. Also, I've even covered this too, because he talks about it a lot. He criticizes Texas a lot, and obviously he's got the ties back with Tom Herman and Chris Ash, but the Urban Meyer to Texas idea has been thrown around a lot. He did make that move to Ohio State, but it seemed like he was facing some real health problems when he left Ohio State. And it was kind of like the way that Chris Peterson left Washington to Jimmy Lake. It just seemed like it might actually be the end, or at least for a while, for Urban Meyer. So I don't know if that's the most realistic situation. And that's probably the top name on Texas's list if they were to move on from Tom Herman. I think just the lack of uncertainty of another coach taking over combined with just it being a weird pandemic year would be the reasons against firing Tom Herman. But I just named like kind of a soft 2021 recruiting class combined with just not too successful coordinator hires, bad penalties, special teams problems. And you know what? Tom Herman's had 4 years now, and he had a really big opportunity with an experienced and talented Texas team. And maybe what will be the final year with Sam Ehlinger on the 40 acres. And they've lost 2 of their 4 games this season against, probably the most down Oklahoma team that we'll see in a while. And also a very winnable game over TCU. They almost lost Texas Tech. They were like this close from being 1-3. Their only win coming over UTEP. So I don't think it's just hard to come up with reasons why Tom Herman should still be there beyond the fact that just 2020 has been a rough year. And it's hard to kind of fire someone based off of that. But Texas has got to turn the page. They've got to find a more successful head coach. Tom Herman's 27-17 in his time in Texas. I think as a whole, his tenure Texas has been more successful than Charlie Strong's. Like Charlie Strong only made 1 postseason in 3 years, lost to Kansas. He had some good upset good upsets against like Baylor and OU, but also Herman's like 1-3 against OU, which is not great given they probably could have won it in 2017 and definitely should have won the game this year. So that pretty much concludes the video. There's like 5 million reasons that I can give either for or against keeping Tom Herman. Just little bits and pieces here and there in terms of particular impact on players or games or anything like that, or for the rest of the season. But as a whole, I do think it's time for him to go. It's hard to figure out exactly when that should happen. That's why I say it should be ASAP or in the near future. As soon as possible means as soon as Chris Del Conte feels like it's possible to go ahead and pull the trigger on doing that. I'd love to hear y'all's takes on this. I know that Texas is always a hotly discussed program, especially when people are considering the whole Texas is back discussion and they disappoint like they have so far this season. And it'll be interesting to see where they go from here. I always find myself saying that a team like Texas, when they're having a rough stretch, that whenever you have the first bye week in the midst of conference play, that it comes at a good time. I actually think this bye week couldn't come at a worse time for Texas, just because there's going to be a lot of pressure coming toward Herman, probably, and Ellinger, and definitely the rest of that coaching staff. And just there's a lot going on right now. You have the whole Eyes of Texas controversy that adds a whole nother layer to this. Texas has obviously been very heavy in the midst of the equality, racial equality, and that social activism conversation this year. And, for better, giving the players a voice. For worse, you've had just this social media firestorm that's added so many layers to an already difficult situation with Herman this year. So there's a lot that he's dealing with, and there's a lot that the program and the school are dealing with. But I think just keeping the focus on football, it's probably past time for him to go. So that's my take on the matter. Again, love to hear what y'all have to say about it. I know that Herman's on one of the hottest seats in the country right now, so I'm sure I'll get my fair share of agrees. If you disagree, then definitely let me know why. But, that's pretty much it. So yeah.